going to be now learning Daf Yud Beis. Today's shir, or tonight's shir I should say, is for Refuah Shlema, Karav Mamish to Rafal Chaim Meir Ben Sima Chasha. Should have a speedy Refuah Shlema, Nisim and Niflois. Okay, let's continue. All right, so we said the Mishnah said that he says that when the Mishnah said that when the master redeems, I should say, gives the shtar shicher to the Eved, so he says Shem Yirtza Shlei Lazun, that if the Adon wants, if the master wants, he does not have to sustain his servant. So the Gemara says, we're holding Shem Yirtza Shlei Lazun. So the Gemara says, if the master wishes, he does not have to sustain his slave, and he's allowed to act accordingly. So the Gemara says, Shamas Mina, you conclude from this Mishnah, you can learn from this Mishnah, that the master, the Rav, is legally able to say, right? Sounds familiar? Some people have this mindset. The master says that he can say, the Chayro can come out, he can legally say to his servant, work for me, but I'm not going to sustain you. That's what comes out. From the Mishnah, it will come out that a person can say, Asay imi, work for me, and I'm not going to sustain you. So the Gemara says, absolutely not. This is not, you cannot bring a proof from our Mishnah that Shem Yirtza Shlei Lazun, that a guy could tell, that a master could tell a servant, that work for me and I'm not going to sustain you. It doesn't work that way. So he says, why? What are we dealing with in our Mishnah? The Amri Lei, we're dealing with a case, the Amrar Lei, where he said to the slave, say, Maisi Odecha limizuneisecha, to spend your earnings to sustain yourself. In other words, he said, I'm not going to provide for you. Rather, you work for me, and you make money, and you have to. It's like when somebody comes to work and you say, the guy says, I want to get paid for lunch. I'm sorry, you get paid. I pay you $15, $20 an hour. Pay for your own lunch. So that's what he says. I am not going to provide you, meaning you work, you earn your own money for your own sustenance, and you have to buy your own lunch. But it does not mean that the master can force a slave to work for him without providing him with mezainis, with sustenance. So the Gemara asks, the kavase gabi isha, with regards to a wife, you can ask a question. The chayra, the amar law, in the case, in regards to when the Mishnah said it, with regards to a wife, we said that the husband can never tell his wife, I'm not going to support you. Now, if the case is that the master is telling the servant that you make your own money and buy your own lunch, so in regards to a wife, you could explain the same thing. The Amar Law, that he said to her, spend your earnings to sustain yourself. In other words, the Mishnah rules that a person, like we said, cannot exempt himself from the obligation to provide sustenance for his wife. So the question is, Isha ma'alei, why in this case can't he do that? He's permitted to make a tanai with his wife that she will keep all her earnings and not receive sustenance from him. But the comes out from our Mishnah that the difference between a slave and a wife is that the slave, he could make such a tanai, and the wife he can't. The question is, why not? We know Api Halacha, he can make such a tanai with his wife, saying that anything that you work goes to you, but I'm not going to support you. So the Gemara says, Isha, when the Mishnah mentions the case of the wife earning the money, it's talking about b'deloi sabka. She doesn't earn sufficient sustenance for herself. She goes to work, but she doesn't get paid, right? She works in one of the meisters. She doesn't make money.
What if she's a big
Chas v'shalom, I shouldn't talk that way. What?
She's a
Okay.
big developer, she's making lots of money.
No. So we're talking about. So the Mishnah is talking about that it's not sufficient for his sustenance. In that case, the husband cannot make a tanai and say, you go to work, so you keep your earnings, yishkoyach, you know? So the Gemara asks a shaila, if so, evanami b'deloi safik. In the case that a slave also is referring to a situation where his earnings also are not sufficient for his sustenance. And in other words, he makes money, but it's not enough to sustain himself. So So nevertheless, we see that his Adin can refuse to sustain him. So l'chera, you should be able to say that the Mishnah is talking about that and nevertheless, we see that the Mishnah could tell his Adin that. In other words, work for me, but I will not sustain you. So the Gemara answers and says, no, Avdid Nahim Kreisa lo yishavya. A slave who's not even worth the bread that he consumes. In other words, the guy says that you're working and you're not even producing for me enough to pay for your bread. So what is he needed by his master or the master's wife? In other words, if the value of the labor that he doesn't even pay for the cost of the sustenance, it's like imagine you have a goya, and the work she does, she's eating a lunch from your fridge, and she doesn't even produce that amount of work. Exactly. So the Mishnah certainly does not refer to a case of this kind. So in regards to a wife, the marriage does not depend on her ability to provide for herself for earnings. So one cannot prove from the Mishnah that a Adon can say to his slave, work for me, but I will not sustain for you. So now the Gemara is going to bring different rayas to say, we want to know in this, if a person could say by to the servant, Ase imi ve'eni zoncha. So we would try to bring a proof from our Mishnah that he could, or from the following, right? We try to bring that the Adon could say, Ase imi ve'eni zoncha. So the Gemara says that you can't bring such a raya. So now the Gemara now is going to try to bring a few tashmas, a few rayas that a person could, that an Adon could do that. Okay. So now the Gemara brings the first raya. Tashma, come and bring a raya from this brisa. Evet shegala la'ori miklat. Let's say a slave who killed unintentionally, killed by mistake. So now he has to go to Ori Miklat. He has to go to the city of refuge. So ein rabbi chayav l'zoini. The halacha is that his master is not required to sustain him. And not only that, api halacha el shemaisi yadav l'rabbi. Api halacha, his earnings, also whatever he makes in the city of refuge, also belong to his master.
Oh, really? Why?
Now, shma mina. So the Gemara says that l'chera, from this brisa, it will come out that yocha harav leimer le'evet. So l'chera can come out from this brisa that the master can tell his servant, asei imi v'aina zancha. Now, the fact that in this case the slave is now is exiled to Ari Miklat, and we know the master, the Adon, is entitled to all his earnings, despite the fact that he has to sustain him. That's what the brisa says.
He's not sustaining him.
So
He's not doing anything.
that's the point. The point is he's not sustaining him yet. He's entitled to all his earnings. So the chayra, it should come out, the amarlei, say maisi yodecha limizunei secha. So the chayra will come out from this Mishnah, or this brisa, I should say, that the master can tell him, spend your earnings to sustain yourself. So the Gemara says, if so, if the master said this to his slave, so ma'isi yadav and ma'ila rabbi. So then the question is, if that's the case, so why does his earnings belong to his master? If the Adon now made a tanai that he should sustain himself, so fine, sustain yourself, but you don't get the earnings. So the Gemara answers and says lahadaf. We're talking about the extra. In other words, he makes more money than he needs. So if the slave works and he makes more money than the cost of his sustenance, then the hadafa, the extra money he makes, belongs to the Adon. The Gemara says, hadafa, if we're talking about the extra pshita, obviously belongs to the Adon. Why would the Bryce need to tell me that? So the Gemara answers and says, Ma'od detema, you would think, kiven de chilesle lo yoyle, since in the case when he does not work enough, so we know in that case, if he does not work enough, the master does not give him all that he needs. Even if he doesn't make enough money, it's not the master's issue. So l'chayra ki islei nami lishkol mina. So then, when he has extra from his work, the master should also not be entitled. In other words, you can't have it both ways. If when I'm short, you don't have to cover the budget. So when I have extra, also you shouldn't be entitled to that. So Kamash Malan, therefore the Brisa teaches us that even though you can have such a consideration, the hadafa belongs to who? To the master.
What's the question?
Eved.
He
Yeah.
earns his.
Talking about Ebed Kanani, that
He owns the Parmesan again. Lunch in Balabos.
right.
Everything he earns is his. The Hamamin.
Oh, so he said before, so he's making a Tanai, and he says, he's basically saying that everything's his, but you still the Adon still has to support him.
So it's on the children.
No, but it's on himself. He says, a guy works for you. You have to pay him something. You can't. It's not. You have to pay the guy something. So here he says, look, you work. I don't have to. We try to bring rayas over here that the Adon could tell him ein izancha. So the Gemara till now is saying is that if he makes a tanai and says that I'm making a tanai with you that I'm not supporting you. Whatever money you make, you keep yourself. You support yourself.
You can do that. I think what he's saying is some of the time you work for yourself. I mean, yes, he's having.
So I didn't understand it that way. I understood it that the Adon has to pay him some money. While he works, the Adon is paying him some money. So he's saying that I don't have to go and pay you lunchtime. I don't have to pay you the... That's how I understood it.
I think you're right.
Okay.
You're not allowed to kill him.
It's Masi Dek.
Okay, let's go. I don't want to, because there's a bunch of people online now. I don't want to. Let's take questions offline. Okay, so the Gemara asks and says, so the Gemara asks like this: Umay shna la'ari miklat. So what's so special? You're saying that if the servant runs away to Ari Miklat, that Dafka in this case. Why are you picking Dafka case of Ari Miklat? According to this reasoning, if you have Adafa and belongs to the master, so why are you saying Dafka and Ari Miklat anywhere? So Mar says, Sol Gadai Dechamina, you would say that since the Torah says V'choy, since the Torah says, right, the Torah says V'nos el achas min ha'arem ha'el V'choy. That, in other words, Ovid leich yusetvei. You have to make sure that he has parnasa in a nice way, and make sure that he has what to live off. Therefore, the Brisa tells me that even though the master could still take the extra that he makes from his servant. The hadaf for the extra, yeah. Now, so frankly, but from the fact that the later clause of the Brisa teaches, but the fact that the Sefer says that if the wife is goyla l'ari miklat, so the baila is chai b'mizenisa, the husband does have to support her. Michlal delay amar la. So you can learn from here that the Brisa is talking about a case where he did not say this to her. In other words,
What did he say?
one second. The fact that the Brisa said aval isha shegos l'ari miklat baila chayev b'mizenisa, which l'chayra it's mashma that we're dealing with a case where he did not say to her, spend your own money to sustain yourself, which is why he has to sustain her. So the Gemara says, the Amrla, because if we're talking about that he didn't make the stipulation with her, by the Chayev, why is the husband Chayev to support her? So the Gemara says, and with the Sefer the Amrla, and from the fact that the later clause of the Brisa is speaking about a case where he did not say this to her, Reishanami the Amrla must be that the Reisha is not talking where he said this to the slave, spend your own earnings and sustain yourself. In other words, the two cases of the Brisa must be referring to a similar case, or they would not have been taught together. So the Gemara says, La'olam da'amar le. Really, actually, the Brisa is referring to a case where the master said to the Adon said to the slave that spend your own earnings and sustain yourself, and the husband really said the same statement. But however, Isha b'deloi sopka. In the case of the woman, is referring to a situation when her earnings are not sufficient for her own sustenance. So the Gemara asks, but the fact that the last Seifa teaches, it says, the fact that the Seifa says, if the husband said to her, spend your earnings to sustain yourself, so the halacha is Rashi, he's permitted. Must be that the Reish is talking about that he didn't say anything. So my answer is, it says like this: this is what the Brisa means to say. If her earnings are enough to pay for her sustenance, and he said to her, spend your earnings to sustain yourself. Rashi is permitted for him to say this. So the Gemara asks that maspekes, if the Brisa is referring to a case where her earnings is enough, l'may memra, what's the purpose of stating this halacha about Orei Miklat? It should work always. So the Gemara answers and says, you would say that I have a pasuk that says that from this pasuk we learn that it's improper for a wife to spend too much time outside her home. Exactly. So this woman's husband, the chayyur, should be concerned that when she's in the Arei Miklat, she should not work at home, but stay at home. So Kamash Malon, therefore the Brisa teaches us that there's no need to be concerned about this, and her husband may say to her, basically, you spend your earnings to sustain yourself, even in Arei Miklat, we don't worry about Kol Kveda Bas Melech Pnima. Okay, now with regards to the question of whether Adon can decide to stop providing sustenance for a slave while the slave continues to serve him, so now the Gemara says, let us say that be'emes, this is a machlekes tanoim. It was taught. Rabbi Shimon Gamliel says, Yochel Eved Leimer LaRabbi B'shnei Batzeris. Rabbi Shimon Gamliel says, a slave can say to his master in years of famine, he says like this, the slave tells his master in B'shnei Batzeris, in the years of famine, Oy parnaseni, oy hitzieni lecheres. He says, either you sustain me from poverty or you have to release me. The Chacham say in the Brisa, Harashos biyad Rabbi. His master has a permission to basically retain his ownership over him even without sustaining him. That's the machlekes tanoim. So the Gemara says, My lab b'hokim must be, what do they disagree with? They disagree that the Mar Savar, that the Chachamim hold that an Adon can say to the slave that he should work for him and not the Mar Savar Yochel. From the fact that the Brisa said that the Chacham said Reshus biyad Rabbi means that we see that the Adon can tell his servant, work for me and I'm not going to sustain you. And Rabbi Shimon Gamliel says that only, Shimon Gamliel holds that the master cannot say so, and therefore he's required to free him. So the Gemara says, V'tizbara, do you really understand the machlekes this way? Do you think this is machlekes? Now, you use this expression, either sustain me or free me. It's not an accurate expression. The Brisa should have said, he should have said, either sustain me or give me my earnings for my sustenance, if that's the case. Why are you? What's the difference if it's a years of famine or not? The same machlekes should apply in all years. So when it says, what are we dealing with over here? The Brisa, we're dealing with the case when the master said to the slave, say maisiyadecha limizinasecha. Spend your earnings to sustain yourself, and during the years of famine, lo safik, the slave's earnings is not enough to provide for himself. So that's the machlekes. The machlekes is, can he say either release me, and the Chacham say he can't. So the Gemara explains. Shimon ben Gamliel says, Oy parnaseni, oy tzeini lechedos. Either sustain me or free me. Why? So that people will see me, that I'm in a helpless state, and they're going to have mercy and provide me with tzedakah. But Abban Savri and the Chacham hold, those who have mercy on regular people, will have mercy on a slave. So it's not necessarily for the slave to be free for him to receive generosity from people. So the Brisa basically is not even talking about a case if the master can say work for me or not. It's talking about a total different case. Okay, so now the Gemara doesn't let go, and it says again, Toshma, come, I'll bring you a proof from the following statement. The Omar Rav says, Hamakdish yodei avdei. If a person now, in the case of a person now, like he consecrates the hands of a slave, he says that basically all the work that my slave is going to do is going to belong to the Beis HaMikdash. And what happens is by saying that the Yidei Avdei is hektish, what comes out is that basically any work that the slave does, he can't really do any work on his behalf. So what do? So the slave, what does he do? The slave now borrows and eats, and afterwards he performs work and he repays what he borrowed. So we should conclude from this Rav statement that that the can come out that a master can tell a slave, work for me and I will not sustain you. Right? In this case, the Adon prevented a slave from working for himself. And yet he's not required to provide for him. What happened over here? The Adon was makdish the hands of the servant, and now the servant, basically anything that he works belongs to the hektish. So what does he do? He has to borrow and pay back. So and the adon is off the hook. So we see l'chayra that asei mivein is anach. So the Gemara says no. What are we dealing with? The case of b'mayla lo mezenes, where the master provides sustenance for him. So the Gemara says if so, if that's the case that the master gives him sustenance, taf yud beis amid beis. So lemai leva. So now the question is lemai leva v'eichel. So then why does he find it necessary to eat? The master is giving him food, so why is he buying his own food? So this Gemara says la daf is talking about extra food. In other words, he's hungry and he wants to have additional food that he wants to eat. He wants to have a good snack at night. So al pi halacha, the adon doesn't have to pay him, but to pay for it, but he wants that. So the Gemara says v'leima le hektish. But if so, let the hektish, in other words, the temple treasurer, let him say to the servant, tell him ad hashka sagiloch b'lo hadafa. Till now, it was enough for you without the extra. V'hashtanami tizgile b'lo hadafa. Now too should be enough without the extra. In other words, why are you looking for more food? So the chayra, the hektish should belong to the hadafa as well. So the Gemara says hektish gufei nechele. That it's preferable for the treasurer itself that he work and eat more. Why? In order that the value of the slave will be enhanced. When he consumes the extra amount, he will become stronger. Now it says instead that the slave borrows and eats, and afterwards he performs work and repays the loan. So the Gemara asks, "Kama kama the kodesh." Now, when he works, the work immediately becomes hektish, because we said his hands is hektish. So how could you repay the loan back? That's the Gemara's question. So the Gemara says very simple: the slave performs work for less than the value of a pruta. So, and we know anything worth less than a pruta is not hektish. So therefore, he can collect these small sums. He collects what less than a pruta, and he pays it back. Very little. So the Gemara says, "Hachinam mistaber." So too, it makes sense. The Amar Rav says, "Hamakdish yidei avdei." If a person is makdish the hands of a slave, the slave works and eats. The ilay avdin man polachli, and as if the slave does not work for himself, who will work and provide for him? In other words, so what do we see from Rav? He says that the the hektish of the hands doesn't work. So the Gemara explains. If you say that the halacha that Rav said that the slave borrows and repays refers to a situation where his master provides sustenance for him, and this is because, in general, he cannot say to him, in other words, like we said, work for me and I will sustain. And the second halacha is referring to a case where the master does not provide with him sustenance, and therefore he cannot be makdish a slave's hands. So then it makes a lot of sense. There's no steer between the two statements of Rav. But if you say that the first halacha is speaking about a case where the adon does not provide sustenance for him, and the hektish is effective because he can tell his slave, work for me, but I'm not going to sustain you. So what is the meaning? So then v'yachol, and then in the case that the slave does work for himself, the ilay avdin man palachli. And now, if the slave does not work for himself, who will work for him? Man de boy niflachi. Let whoever desires work for him. In other words, the slave will be forced to sustain himself from tzedakah. But this is and the chayr, there shouldn't be the concern of the master. So the Gemara said, "Lav shmamina." The halacha is eine yachol. The halacha is that a person cannot tell his servant, "You you work for me, but I will not sustain you." Shmamina. So from here, even though we try to bring tons of rayas, we conclude from here that this is the case, that a person cannot say, "You sustain yourself, and I will not. You support. You work for me, and I will not sustain you."
You can't enforce that. And the ketubah also says you have to provide for your wife.
Correct. Here we're talking about not a wife. We're talking about a eved. Yeah. Okay. Tashma, come in here. Another concern. The same shaila.
You want some waters?
I'm good. Thank you. The Rabbi Yochanan says, "Hakitea yad avdei shel chaverei." So now it's just like this. So somebody cuts off the hand of another slave. Somebody comes and he cuts off the hand of another slave. So the halacha is neisen shiftei ufuasel rabbi. He has to give compensation for the loss of livelihood. In other words, he has to pay for the slave's inability to work as a result of the injury. Neisen shiftei ufuasel rabbi, and the medical cost also goes to the master. Now, and the slave who can no longer work is sustained from tzedakah. So the Gemara says, Shema, let's learn from this brisa. Let's learn from Rabbi Yochanan here that if the master said, work for me and I will not sustain you, so the chayyur should work. So why? How do you see that from this brisa? Because otherwise, the other would not receive compensation for the time in the form of payment for the slave's earning while the slave lives off tzedakah. In other words, we're saying that he has to give the medical cost to his master, and now, so the fact is, the fact that the master would not, otherwise the master would not receive compensation for his time in the form of payment for the slave's earning while the slave lives off tzedakah. So the Gemara says, we're talking about b'mayla mizinis, we're dealing with a case where the master provides sustenance for him. So the Gemara says, so why is he going to tzedakah? He has sustenance. So the Gemara answers and says, la'adaf, we're talking about extra. So the Gemara says, so if this is so, why are you saying sustained from tzedakah? It should have said that he misparnes ben mibayla. It should have said that he earns his livelihood from there. Or he should have said he earns his living from tzedakah. It must be that yochel. From here we can conclude that a person could say to his wife, to his slave, work for me, but I will not sustain. Shma mino. Okay. Now, Amar Mar, we learned, Nason shifted of us to the rabbi, that he can give compensation for that he has to give compensation for the slave's loss of livelihood and his medical costs for his adon. So the Gemara says, with regards to the compensation for the shifta, his livelihood, pshita, it's obvious that in other words, the master had a lot of loss when the slave does not work, so obviously he has to pay. The Gemara says, it's really necessary to tell me to mention only the medical costs. So the Gemara says, why is the payment for the medical cost given to the adon? Shouldn't the medical cost belong to him? The boy as he needs to be healed with it. So the Gemara says, here we're talking about a case where the doctors estimated that this blow or this wound would heal in 5 days, and they made a strong medicine for him, and he was healed really in 3 days instead of 5. So Ma'adatema, you would think that Sarah, that since the pain suffered by the slave by taking the strong medicine that caused a decrease in the cost of healing was his, right? Because he had the Mr. Never for the medicine. So Dideu, so the extra money should go to him. Therefore, Rabbi Yochanan teaches us that this is not the case, and even this money belongs to the master, not the slave. Tanya, we learned in a brisa. Rabbi Elazar says, "Amarnu loyle meir." Okay, so now he says like this. In regards to the discussion, it's in the Meir and the Chacham. It says in the brisa that Rabbi Elazar said that we said to Meir, but isn't it an interest of a slave to leave his master to freedom? So Amar Lanu, he said to us, no, it's a detriment to him. Why? Shemaya Eved Kohen, because if the Eved was Eved Kohen, he's posted him truma. Amar Naloi, so we said, now what would be? So we said to him, but what would it be if the master wishes not to sustain him, not provide him with a living? So the chayyur should be Rashi, it should be permitted. So therefore the slave does not lose out when he is free, as he was not guaranteed sustenance in any event. Okay. So now Amar Lanu, Rameir said to us, what did Rameir say? That even if the thank you very much. Thank you. He says this, even if the master is not obligated to provide for him, it's still permitted for the slave to partake of truma. Now, why? What's the proof to this? He says this: "Ama ilu eved kohen shebarach." What would be in case if the slave of a kohen who fled from his master, or ve'ishes kohen shemordal baila, or let's say you have the wife of a kohen that shemordal baila rebelled against her husband. In other words, she refused to fulfill the obligations that a woman has to. So the din is hala eichlem truma. Are they not permitted to partake of truma? So v'zeh einei yochel. Now, this slave who was free is not allowed to partake of truma, even truma that belongs to other kohenim. Al isha chayvula. But in regards to a woman, the divorce is a detriment to her. She can place them in truma mafsidim namazenes because it causes her to lose truma and lose her sustenance. So now the Gemara wants to analyze the brisa. Maika amrle and Maika mahadle. What did the Chachamim say to the mayor, and what did he respond to them? So he says, Hachi amrlehu. So he says, this is what the mayor was saying to them. Hashaftuni al mazenis. You answered me about sustenance, that the master, that the Adon is not required to provide for his slave. But matishuvin al truma. How are you going to answer me on truma? And he says, V'chi temron. If you're going to say that iboi, that if the master desires zarg legito puzzle, he could throw a get shikhr within dalat amas of the slave and disqualify him from truma. Now, so the din is that shavik leiv arik v'ozul almo. The slave can prevent this from happening by leaving his master and escaping and going out of the world. In other words, if he acts in this way, his master will be unable to free him, and he can continue to have truma. Okay, now we're holding Daf Gimel. We're going to hold. What time is it? Okay. So he says this, and Rameir says this. And what would be in the case of the slave of a kohen who fled from his master, or a wife, or Eishes kohen shemordal baila, or a wife of a kohen who rebelled against her husband? Nevertheless, they can still eat truma v'zeh in a yochel. Okay, so the Gemara asks, Shaprak Amar, the Cheder Meir is saying, is responding very well to the Chachamim. So Amar Rav says, this is what they answered to him in the Mishnah. They said, they said because, remember we asked before, what does it mean that the guy is his master's acquisition? So he says, because if the master wants to disqualify his slave from having truma, he can take 4 dinners from any yid in exchange for the slave, and thereby he'll disqualify him. In other words, he could sell the guy in a second, and will disqualify him from truma. So the Gemara says, "Meir, Quinter Meir, Tinech Evet Kohen, granted by Evet Kohen, Evet Yisrael Michael Meimer." What about Evet Yisrael? Because by freeing him from his master, it causes him to lose the option of having relations with Evet Knanis. The Gemara says, now this guy can go ahead and marry Baschern. So the Gemara says, this always quotes this line, Avda be'efkeda nichali, that a servant would rather be free. In other words, he'd rather be an efkedus. Zilo lei, because she is lowly to him, and shchicha lei, this Evet Knanis is available for him, and pritza lei, she's unrestricted to him, and this Evet, even though he can marry Baschern, he'd rather have this type of relationship. Okay, we're holding now Daf Gimel. So the Seder tomorrow is going to be like this. Tomorrow, 8:45, right after Shachris, we'll do Yud Gimel, and then 2 o'clock before Shabbos we'll finish the Perek. Then Sunday, I think Sunday and Monday we'll do 2 blot, and then Sunday and Monday we're going to do 2 blot, and then Tuesday we're back to 1 blot.